Hello, welcome to another series of CSS training. In this lesson, we will be looking at grid system. CSS grid layout modules offer a grid-based layout system with rows and columns, making it easier to design web pages without having to use float, clear, or positioning method. Grid layout consists of a parent element with one or more child elements. Our parent class, or rather our parent element, and also a child element. That's the basic structure of how you could design a grid layout system. So just for practice, we'll have two there, and we can have content 1 and 2. One of the definitions that we gave you was the fact that the parent class will give it a name, the parent element will give it a name and call it grid container. So a grid system must have a container, meaning it must have a parent element, whereby and then it can have as many children as there is based on the kind of template you want to design. So here we're just going to do something very simple to get the idea out there so that you can get to understand what we are doing. So we don't have any template in mind now, we just want to do a simple grid so that you can see what is obtainable. Grid container will be our class to house the grid system, while the item grid or grid item will serve as the child item or the child element. So this way we could style each of the different parameters separately. So let's get to the styling part, which is what brings the magic to happen. So let's come here and do grid container. What triggers the grid system is a display property, and we've already done display in our previous video. We've been able to define quite a lot of display value. We've talked about block, we've talked about inline block, and then we talked about none. We're going to introduce something new today, and which is going to be grid. Because we're talking about the grid system, the display property allows you to set an element to have a grid kind of a setup. So for your container, for your grid container, you have to set the display property to grid. It's one of the requirements. So that has been done. The next thing we need to do is to set the template of how our grid should be laid out. Grids are generally in rows and columns or rows. That's already formed. So you need to tell the container, you need to tell this container here, which is the grid container, how the grid should be formed, how many rows that you want to have, and how many columns you want to have in terms of the width and the height, the dimension of the row and column. That's the next point of action for us to do. By the way, we are going to be defining 3 properties, and those 3 properties are the fundamental guide to defining a grid system. The first thing we've talked about now is a display, which we have to set to grid. The next part is to specify either the template of the column first or the row. So let's go ahead with the column. So we'll have grid template column. And what this does is to specify how many columns you want to have in your grid. How many columns you want to specify in your grid. We just do 2 for a start. So a way to specify 2 is to either say you want to put a physical width to it, like let's say 200 pixels by 200 pixels. What this means is that you are telling your column to be 200 by 200, 200, or your column to be 200. You know we're specifying 2 now. That's why you have that there. If you want it to be 3, you have to keep adding the sizes of the columns continuously until you max out on all the columns you want to have. So this is for column. So you can change this unit measurement to anything that you want. So you could do, even in percentage, 50% by 50%. Obviously, you will notice that it's going to stretch out to take the whole width. So that's what you have. So let's do a perfect grid 50-50 like this. The next part is how you want the row to be sized. Again, the same way we capture the column, we're going to say grid template, but this time around it's going to be rows. In table, you learned that we have rows and columns. Rows are from the left to the right, while columns are from the top to the bottom. So now we only have one row here, and what you can do in the row is also to specify how high that row is going to be. So for point of reference, even though we don't have anything to know what we're doing, we could just set it to auto. Then we'll come back to it later, and then you see how we can toggle this setting. Now, what we've been able to do successfully now is to define a grid container. If you go ahead and start adding content to your grid container, you have more items, you will notice that the system will start building what we call a grid-like feature. And as you can see, it's giving you 2 by 3, for example, 2 by 3 system. And as you build it more, you're going to have it in this format. So you can change the order of what you have in terms of saying you want 3 columns as opposed to 2 columns that you have here. How do you determine how many columns you have? Is by this property that we've specified here. So you could easily say, oh, okay, you want this to be moved to, by the way, this is 100%. So you could decide that you want 25%, you want 50%, and then another 25%. So that is that. So you could see that this is 25%, this is a whole 50%, and then you have this that way. This is how you can specify that you want 3 columns. The rows are dynamic, so you don't need to specify how many rows you have. They are dynamic. What you could do to the row is to specify how high the height of the row. So let's go ahead and specify the height of the first row. So you could say the first row can be, let me do 500 pixels. So do you see what happened? Immediately stretch this by 500. Then you could specify what the next one will be, like that. So the column is on top like this from top to bottom, while the row is from left to right. So specifying 500 only applies to the first one. Let's now introduce the child elements. Let's talk about the grid item, because what we've been talking about all this time now is your grid container. Let's look at what the grid item has to offer. We have a lot of sophisticated things we're going to be doing, so this is just like the starting point. So let's introduce the grid item. Bring out in the grid item is not anything particular, but just for us to style it so that we can have colors and see how the grid is standing, how the item is standing in the grid. So I want to have color display so that we can have borders and what have you. So let's do background color. So you could see that our grid system didn't align to 100%. That's why we have excess of space here. But that's fine. We could always make that up and have it perfect like this. So let's have border. Okay, so it's a little bit appealing now visually. You can then picture what it is we've been doing so far. Now let's add more columns or more rows so that we can demonstrate other things. So let's have 7, and as you add those columns, you can see what happens. The part that doesn't have to show anything will just fill that way. So it's looking more of like a table. We worked with a table, and then this kind of effect that it gives when you're working with a table. Now I want to talk about these rows again. What we have, remember that what this row deals with is the first one that we have here. To be able to look at the second one, you have to have it on the next space and then the value. So if you want to do, let's say 200, you can see that stretch. Let's change this to 300 because we're running out of screen, and we change this to 300. So you can see what that does. You can individually change each of the rows, to match what you want, what you desire. And if you just want the content to determine the row, you could just end up doing auto. So if you do auto, it will just work or you could literally just ignore it and leave it out of the way. It won't bother you. It's not a requirement for you to have that setup if you don't want it. But your column is very important. Your grid template column is very important. If you remove it, everything goes away. Even though you specify there is a grid system, it's working like a grid system, but you didn't define the column in which those grid system is going to be arranged, in which all the column is going to be arranged. So the work of this is to give you this particular feature and effect. Another thing I want to mention is the way that we measure the contents here, and that is using a new measurement, a new way of measurement, and that's using fractional units, which is used by FR. FR denotes fractional units. That's a fraction of what you are working with. So introducing that rule, we can do FR here and say this is 1 FR. It's the same thing as saying 100%, which nothing changes. So if I do 1 FR, which means a full width, I can decide and say, okay, another full width. So the system will plot this for me. So what this means in the essence is like 50-50%. That's the idea of what this is translating to. And because it's possible for you to want 3 equal parts, it's going to be difficult for you to achieve it with percentage. Yeah, we know I can do 33%, but you will know that this is not equal to, all of them are not having equal width. You will have an excess here on the right hand side. So how do you address that? Is with the 1 FR, 1 FR. So where FR is fraction, he's talking about the fraction of a unit. Okay, there are more things you can do with this FR, which I'm going to illustrate. So if you want to create, you can create 2 parts of this column, meaning you can have numbers here that will change, and that will be, the system will calculate number of FRs that is supposed to be there so that you can have a balanced columns. What I mean by that is this: if you come here and you say you have 5 FRs, it doesn't make any difference that you said it is 5 FR, as long as there's nothing to compete with the fact that it's a 5 FR. Unlike when you say 90%. If you say 90%, it will really give you 90% of 100. So 5 FR is same as 1 FR because it's not competing with anything. By the time you have it compete with something, and by the way, if you do another 5 FR, it's going to do it like 50-50. So half, because this is equal to this. But this is where the fun comes to play. Imagine you say 1 FR. So it now turns everything to 6. It adds everything together and say, oh, this is 6. And then what's the 1 fraction of 6? So this is 1/6 of what you have here. So you can go ahead and say, oh, okay, give me 2 of 7, then 3 of 8, then 4 of 5, that's 4 of 9 rather, and then you have 5 of 5. That's how you have equal side. So that's what this FR gives you, comes to play. That's what it does for you. It makes your templating easy, it makes your measurement easy. We're going to see it more in the system. And it only applies to templating and flex, not with other forms of units. It doesn't work with padding or margin. It only works with a grid system like this. Okay, so let's add more dynamism to this, and then let's have more experiments with this FR of a thing. So let's go ahead and do one more FR and 1 FR as well. And let's say you want to make what is in the center to be, balanced in terms of you want it to be more than left and right. You want it to be 2/3 of what is on this part. So if you do 2 here, this one will be equivalent of 2 times what is inside here. So this is 2 of 4, meaning you have 1 FR plus 1 FR, which is 3, and then plus another 1, which is 4. So you have 2 of 4, what is here. So you could do as many experiments as you want, just to meet the kind of templates that you want. So you could keep doing, just to give you an example, an idea of what you are looking for. And this is also applicable to rows as well. So you can have that same effect set up as against for row. So you can see here now, it's help out. You don't need to worry about numbers or specific. You are using the width of the total column that you have to determine what the height or width of the content should be. So you could go and do this. You could do 1, 2, 3. You knowing that the one here is twice of this, and this is 3 times of 1, just like it is saying here. So that's giving you a template on something to work with. Plain other form of display that we have, which is inline grid. What I just showed you is a grid system. A grid spans out from left to right fully. It takes over the whole space. So what happens when you do an inline grid? An inline grid allows you to have another element, stay alongside it. Just the way we have inline block, we also have inline grid. So what that means is, after I'm done with the container, I could actually have another element standing close to it. You might want to do this, but if you want it to just take over everything, you will need to specify just grid. You don't need to use the word inline. Inline means, you can have items side by side, with each other. So that's what I just needed to spell out there in the display. You can use inline or grid. Now we've covered quite a lot of things under a display. We've covered non-block, inline block, display, grid, inline grid. Another thing that we want to cover under the grid container is column gap. Column gap is the distance between each of the columns that you have here, and they are the gap in between the columns. So the best way to demonstrate this is to just show you an example. So if we have a column gap there and we do a 20, so you can see the gap in between columns are being highlighted, and this will give you, based on the use case of what you want to do. If you want to, instead of using padding, for example, you could implement what you have under the grid system to just say you want a column gap and not worry about implementing padding on each item, so that you can make use of all the extra widths that you want to make use of. Obviously, you will agree that if there's a column gap, there should be a row gap. So there's also a row gap, and what that does is to apply the same thing we've done into rows. Looking interesting now. Depends on your use case. You might not want to implement these gaps, but those gaps are there to give you various options that you want to do. And you can implement this in form of just specifying gap instead of row gap and space, and instead of having it as an individual property, we could just say gap and pass in the parameter that you want to pass, like say 20 will apply to both. But if you want one to be different from the other one, the first one is the row while the second one is the column. So you can say you want 10 by 50, so 10 being the row and 50 being the column. Now obviously, if we are planning to do a template, we will not have a template looking like this. We'll need to have something like a header section that will take over 1, 2 and 3. We'll need the menu to be in number 4. Then we will need 5 and 6, for example, to become the content. We will need 7, 8 and 9 to become the footer. So we will need to find a way to work with this. There are other things we want to work with now, and that's doing what we call spanning, ability to merge rows together or columns together, or to make a column take over the entire row. Not just merging. We're not really doing merging like tables. We are making it taking the entire row of a particular in a grid system. So let's see what are the properties that is responsible for that. And that property is called grid column start and end. We won't just apply the property directly on our items here, because if you notice, each and every item here is called grid item. So the property is that which of these columns do we want to have to maintain that merge, feature. We want to do it in a way that it will take over the row such that 2 and 3 will be at the bottom. We want to use this one. So I will just call it header for a better description. And instead of calling it, let me leave numbers to be 1, 2, 3 so that for easier visual representation of what's going on. Because I want to make sure that the header spans across the entire row, I will need to style that header and introduce some new properties. And that property is called grid column start. What that does is to tell it where my grid is starting from. That's the column of the grid, where it's starting from and where it's going to end. So I want it to start from number 1, which is here, the first thing I'm doing here. By the way, this can be implemented in any part of the grid or any part of the column. If I want 5, for example, so that means that I'm starting from the 5th column, so I need to specify. So, but because I'm starting from the first one, that's why I'm using 1 here. And where do I want it to end? You have to specify also. So I just duplicate this and I have my end here. I want it to end here, the 4th one, meaning I want to go 1, 2, 3. So stop at the 4th one. Don't include the 4th one. Stop at the 4th one. So if I put my 4 here, I have this effect. What this is doing is that it's starting the grid system from 1 and ending at 4. More like ending at 3. But the parameter is like you have to put 4 there to terminate it at that point. So let's take another example. And this time around, we want to have where we want to merge or want to span 3 and 4 together. Remember what we're trying to do? We're trying to imagine this is a template, and in that template, you have your header where you have your logo and menu system, logo and search bar. And then your number 2 is supposed to contain your navigational button. And then your number 3 is supposed to contain your content. But this time around, we want to make sure that our content pushes 3 and 4 in such a way that it gives us that room to make our content flow in that section. So what do we then do? Remember what we're doing, we're styling 3. So it means you're going to style this 3 guy. So to style it, we need to give it a class name. And this time around, we're going to call it content. So we're styling our content this way. We're going to implement the same thing, but this time around it's going to be different. What we're starting with is going to be different. We're starting with, so we're going to do grid column end 2, and then we have this. Because where we are spanning over, the space left is 2 spaces. Remember, we have 3 columns. We have 1, we have 2, and we have 3. So because this content is going to be taking over 2 columns, that's why we have it this way. We can repeat the same thing for the footer now. We can make 4, 5, and 6 go away so that the 4 part will take over the footer section. So we can come here and do footer and have this part be footer so that we can then put this in CSS. So we have column starts from 1, which is here. Then the ending part is going to be the same way we have for the first thing we have there, which is 4, column end 4. And these other ones need to be discarded because they are not part of our template. So we have a template for our website already. If we want to do something like this, we can use this to form a kind of content that we want to do. So you could also do a row start and row end, meaning you could determine where your row starts from and where your row ends. You could span across rows and column, just like we just did columns now. You could actually span across row as well. So we'll also do an example. We'll also show you how you could do that. What that means is that you could determine that you want to span 1, 4, 7. You want to span this 1 to take over this column, and such that you can have other things to do with this side of the screen. So let's go ahead and see how we could do that. But it's not going to be like header kind of a thing again. So it might be something else whereby you have maybe a full navigational system on the left hand side, and then you have header at the top, and what have you. So let's look at that and see how we can demonstrate that. The menu system or the layout we want to design, our 1 here will form our navigation. Our 2 will span across the row to form our header. Then our 3 will become our content. Let's just have it designed so you see what I'm talking about. So our 1 will serve as our nav, and our 2 will serve as our header. Our 3 will serve as the content. So let's put that in design and then see how we go. First of all, let's make this O1 take over the space of 4 and 7, so that it forms nav where you can have your menu system designed there. So what we do, the same thing we do for column, we just put because we want to style 1, so we'll put a nav there so that we can properly style it using CSS. Then what are the keywords that we're going to use? What are the properties that we're going to use? The same thing we use for column, but this time around we're going to call it row. That's grid row start, and then we're starting from 1, obviously. Then where it's going to end depends on the number of items or the number of children that the grid has. In this case, it has 9, and the more you have, the more your end will depend on. So if you stack these together now, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4. So I think it should be around 4 or 5. So if we do 4 here, it's giving you this result. And we might need to even change it because we're going to reduce the number of items that we have. So this is what you can actually play with this and see the results. So as you specify the end, it gives you different features. So what that means is we specifying 5 is we have 1, we have 5 there. The next thing we want to do is the fact that we want the header to take over the remaining part here. We want the header to take over the remaining section here so that this whole part will be full. So how do we do that? We are using the number 2 and then we'll call it header, so that we can then go and style the header section using the CSS. Grid row, because we want to span the column. So what we're going to be doing is grid column and specify to where we are starting. If memories serve me right, when we're doing the first one we use 1. This time around we're working on the 2, so we start from 2. The next part is when you're ending. Remember, when we're ending the other time, we count the number of columns that we have, which we terminated at 4. Start from the next one start from 4. So we're gonna end by 4. So if you do that, you can see what happens. It pushes this now forms our header. So the next part is the content, which you might want to also span, or you want to leave it that way depending on the kind of feature you want to create. You might want to say, okay, this is my content. If you want to do a sidebar, you can make number 4 be your sidebar. Sidebar are just other kind of information you want to capture. So you can make this your sidebar, else you might want to stretch this part. And then if you want to make your footer cover the entire space, even to take over navigational space, is possible. So you might want to repeat the same to be your footer. It's optional what we want to do right now, but let's clear 5 to 6. Let's stop at here, and let's say if we want to make number 4 our footer, let's go ahead and decide I want to make our number 4 the footer. So the same thing we did to make this 2 happen this way is the same thing we're going to do to number 4, this one to footer, and see how it will be. So we have options. We can either say, oh, okay, let our footer take the entire bottom section and go this way. In fact, let's do that. Before we can do that, let's do our content to take over. Our content should also look like the header, while the footer should take over the bottom part of the screen. Let's go ahead and do that. I have to style my content. Even though we're talking about row here, we are still end up doing column, which is still fine. So we can have our column here. This time around is going to start from 2, which is the same thing as the header, and we have it this way. This is the same effect we still have like this. So it looks like the content and header are the same thing. Why not put them together? This is just CSS tricks. So what I'm doing right now is that I'm combining the style I did for the header for the content. We want to make this footer take over the entire part here. So let's do that. So again, we do our row starts. We can copy what we have in the content, but this time around we are starting from 1 and we're ending at 4. So we have a simple navigation where we have, or rather a simple layout where we have a navigational button, our header, and our content. So what was able to give us this feature? What are the things that we're able to do to give us this feature? You can see how minimal our HTML is. What are the things that we use? We made use of our template and our column. That's template column, very important. And that allows us to be flexible with this. Even though you might not be using this, the content will determine how this will grow eventually, because more of the time you have a lot of content in your content area. And other things we were able to do is to play with our row, column, row start and row end. That allows us to span across rows and across columns. The thing I want to introduce is grid template areas. What this allows you to do is for you to easily create templates, sophisticated templates, even more sophisticated than what we've been doing all this long. And that one happened to be one of the easiest way to create templates using a grid system. Instead of worrying about merging columns, merging rows, you could just use that to do your template. So quickly, let's clear what we've done so far and have ourselves with just clear information, refreshing our memory back to the beginning by using an approach totally different from what we are used to. This is a different approach, and this approach allows you to create template area, template region, whereby you can just say, oh, this is what should be here and this is what should be here. This method is one of the most easiest and easy to understand and easy to use for complex templates that you might want to design complex layout. So let's give it a go. What's the first requirement that you need to do? The first requirement is to first define those areas. Let's define those areas that we want. So we're building something like this. This is what we're building, and you can change it to whatever you want to do, and you'll see that we're going to change it. So where you have menu, main menu, footer, and right. So let's just go ahead and do something like that. Let's just write all the things we want to do. So we start with our header. So we're just putting down all the writing, what is going to be what. So we have our header section. Let me also name it like number 1, number 2. So it will let you know the order in which I'm having those items being put under the grid container. You have your menu, which is our nav as well. Let's call it nav. Then you have your main. Then you have the right hand side, more like the sidebar. Sidebar. It can be sidebar, it can be anything. Then you have your footer. So we just need only five items, and the idea is that we want to put these items in such a way that they will fit into what we want. So you can put them in the way you want. That's the idea of what we want to do. So we've not done anything much. What we've just been able to do is just to define this as is supposed to be a grid system. That's the only thing we've been able to add here. The next thing is what we need to do to now start giving individual name to this item, because we are going to style them separately. Remember, to move things around, we need to be able to call them using our CSS rules. So we need to style them separately. So I'm going to style them along with the same name that they have. I'm going to style them by that name. That way it's easy for us to work with. So I'm just going to call this guy contents, even though it's still good as main. So I've just created name for them: header, nav, content, sidebar, and footer. Now this is where we need to now start doing the main work. The main work is now giving them a CSS name. Apart from the fact that we're giving them a name here, we need to put the name on the grid. The grid needs to recognize those names. How do we make the grid recognize those names? Is by specifying what we call grid area. So let's define the grid area for header. For example, how do you specify that? To specify a grid area for header, you say grid area, and we can just maintain the same name that we've used. That way it makes it easier. So I just go ahead and say header. It's as easier. I'm going to be reusing the same name I've used for everything. So don't let everything confuse you here. What we've done simply is to say we have a header class that is supposed to house a header part of the website, and we define the class, and that we denote that that area is also called header. Immediately we do this, notice that it disappears. Don't worry about that. We're going to get to the reason why that happened in a short bit. Just let us go ahead and do the same thing to the remaining 4. We're going to repeat the same thing to the remaining 4, and those things are going to disappear. But it's fine if they do, because they're going to come back in a short while. So what I just did again was just define that the nav class is housing a grid area that is called nav. That's just what I need to do. And we are going to see where we're going to make use of all these things. So I'm going to repeat. We have 3 more to go. So let's go ahead and do that 3. Then we have 2 more to go for sidebar. Then we have 1 more to go for footer. Now let's introduce the main, and that part goes to the grid container, because the grid container is now going to arrange everything that goes deleted, and that is there's a property for that, and that property name is called grid template area. Grid template area. And what this property does is to allow you to arrange those properties in a way that you want to arrange them. So I'm presenting this in a way that you can easily view it. And the template is based on their name. I'm going to start using the name I'm going to start typing here will be based on what is here: the header, nav, content, sidebar, footer. Whatever name you've used to define the areas of each of the classes is what you're going to put here, and you're going to put it irrespective of the way you want them to show. So there are some rules that will guide you on what to do. So I'm going to start with the header. So immediately you type the header there, you can see that the header appears on top. And what that does is that it allows you to, and before you even do anything, you have to define how many rows and columns that you want, you have there. Remember, we're going to have our header. Let's look at the picture again so that to give you the idea of what you're looking at. This is going to be 3 rows. Very important to note that there are 3 rows. 1, 2, 3. So how do you denote those rows here? Is by repeating, going to the next line to put the next thing that is supposed to be in that row, which is, in our case, we have nav. Then the third thing that will be on that row is called footer. So this denotes 3 rows. Very important, 3 rows: header, nav, and footer. So if we look at the preview, we should have those things there. Just ignore that other things are not forming, because you're not done with the template, so you're not expecting to see a perfect view of what you're looking at. So we have our header, nav, and footer. The next thing we need to do is that You notice that these other things are inside. How do you then attend to other things that are inside? Is by specifying a space and putting what you want to capture next. And that's the tricky part. You need to also know how many columns that you want to deal with. Remember, we already know the rows, which are 3. How many columns? My guess, you can start with 3, and then I will explain to you how you can span it. This is 1, menu. This is main, menu, and this is right. That gives you like 3 columns. So let's start working with 3 columns first. So it means we have to create 3 columns. How do you create 3? We've seen how to do rows. How do you now make it that is 3? The way to make it that is 3 is this. You knowing that the header takes the whole thing, it means you have to repeat header 3 times. Remember why it's 3? Because we are doing 3 columns. So repeat it 3 times. What then happened? This is not balanced anymore. Line 30, which contains your nav, is not balanced anymore. So how do you make it balanced? By providing your main and right. In our case, is content and what? Sidebar. The footer at the bottom is also not balanced anymore. How do you make it balanced? You create what I call, you increase that part to repeat it 3 times. It takes the whole of the bottom. Footer, footer. So if you check what we have here in the preview, you can then see that we are having something similar, but we're not done yet. Our sidebar is not spelled correctly. Okay, so you can see that we have a template to start with, but we're not done. I'm going to show you other things that you need to do to make the template to look like what we have there. Now, notice that in your template here, you have the navigation taking over part of this section. How do you introduce the nav bar on this section? Is by taking out this footer and make your nav bar replace it. So let's look at the preview so that you can see what's happening. So if we do this and you overtake this, you have this very nice effect. This way you don't need to worry about spanning or roll or doing another thing like calculating the number of column or size that you have. Looking at this, you can have, so let me even do something that make it looks easier to comprehend visually. So this can actually help out in seeing what's going on. Okay, so this is giving you an idea of what's going on. The top part, header, all header, that's fine. The middle part, which is this second row, have a nav, and then the other one, the content, which is fine. This other one also have its own, that's the sidebar number 4, which is fine. And then you have this part repeated, and that's why we have the nav there. What if you want the nav to go up and cut out the header? Very simple. You just replace it with nav here, and that just works. That just works. So this is way easier to do than every other thing I've been showing you. For me, this is my best approach to doing templates. Very easy to implement. You can even take part of footer and put footer to this side and let content take part of the footer here by just changing this part to this, and then you have this view, this dynamic view. So it's very easy. You can even come here and say, oh, okay, footer should come bottom. You are giving more room for content, and footer should come on the bottom. So you can do this and go ahead. So it means now you are turning this to 4 rows now. So if you do footer like this, footer like this, footer like this, so you can have this effect. Therefore, there are some effects you can have. You can have content like this. You can have something like this, because this does not make sense. You can have a grid that goes like this, So it's either you have it this way, this is okay, but you can't have content that goes in an L shape, so that won't work. So you can either have something like this, You can have something like this, or you can have an L-shaped kind of effect. And you can still implement your grid template rows and column. You can still implement this, and you can implement it to your rows as well to give you the ideal spacing that you want for your grid and rows. Next thing we want to look at now is justification or alignment. How do you align items in your content? It's possible that you want this content here to start in the middle, or you want this nav to start at the middle also, or something to start on the right hand side. How do you do that? So you have aligning to the right, to the left. You have items staying in the middle. So there are two things that you can use to align. You can use justify self and align self. So that applies to each of the items that you want to work with. Let's decide that we want the header to align, start from the right, meaning that's where you want your content to start previewing from. So you use something that we call justify self. That's the property. And then since we are specifying it for header alone, you need to go to header class and then do your justify self. You have start and end and also center. So if you do start, the default position that we're looking at now is start. Then you could say end if you want it to start its content from the end, and that way work its way back. You can also do center, and by default it's work with start. So the other part is if you want it to, if you have a tall details like this where you want your content to start from the middle, or you want to align something from the middle, you could use this to work with it. Align self to use that. So we go to content where we have our content here, and we do our align center. You use the align center, and then you can see that your content starts from the middle, and you can combine that with justify center. That way your item stay in absolute center, just like so. So like so, you have your item in absolute middle. So this is also an example of how you can center item in a grid. You use the self alignment, that's the align self, and justify self to precise your item in the middle. Thank you for staying to the end. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and turn on bell notification in order to be notified when we release new videos. See you in the next one.